We have a saying in the world of recovery, like, hate the disease, not the person, right? Know that your loved one that's struggling with substance use is not doing and behaving the way that they're behaving in order to hurt someone, right? You can hate the disease and that it causes them to act in a certain way, but that's not them.
All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Partnership Connections. This is a child welfare training and education podcast for those already working in or with an interest in working in child welfare in Rhode Island. My name is Stan Brazier. I'm the project director for the Learning Partnership between the Rhode Island Department of Children, Youth, and Families, or DCYF, and Rhode Island College. Our desire with this podcast is to bring information from experts on a variety of topics, all at no cost to hardworking professionals and others. Today, I'm very excited to speak with our guests about substance use disorder and implications for child welfare. According to Casey Family Programs, estimates on the prevalence of substance use disorder among families involved with the child welfare system vary widely, ranging from 5% to 90%. So obviously, this range is pretty dramatic. However, parental substance use is cited as a factor in about 26% of substantiated cases of child maltreatment and 36% of cases in which a child is removed from the home. Additionally, families affected by parental substance use disorder have a lower likelihood of successful reunification with their children, and their children tend to stay in foster care longer than children of parents without a substance use disorder. Our guest today is going to help give us some of his thoughts on this data, as well as his own perspective on parenting and parents that might be navigating both recovery as well as involvement with the child welfare system. Please note that the views expressed by the hosts and guests of this podcast are their own and do not necessarily reflect those of the college or DCYF. So without any further ado, our guest today is Chris Dorvald. Chris is the clinical director at Ocean State Recovery Center. He is a nationally recognized speaker, trainer, and clinical consultant in the areas of addiction, trauma, and men's health, as well as having worked as a clinician and clinical supervisor in various levels of care in the addiction treatment continuum. Chris, welcome, and it's great to see you.
Thanks, Dan, and thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, of course. So with that information I kind of gave in the intro there, it sounds kind of like the odds might be stacked against someone, but parents who have a substance use disorder when they become involved with the child welfare system for abuse or neglect, whatever the reason might be. Why might it be more difficult for someone with the substance use disorder to achieve quote unquote success, whatever that might look like for them when they become involved with the child welfare agency?
Sure. One of the reasons is that substance use disorder is a chronic relapsing illness. We often use the word substance use disorder and addiction interchangeably. The American Society of Addiction Medicine published a definition of addiction back in 2007, and in the first line, it identifies addiction as a chronic relapsing brain disease. And interestingly enough, when you look at it compared to other chronic diseases that we are familiar with, like hypertension, diabetes, asthma, it has very similar rates of relapse and remission. About 40% of people, 40 to 60% of people in treatment for diabetes, hypertension, asthma, and addiction will experience some type of relapse throughout their course of treatment. What's different is how we view a relapse in substance use versus how we would view it with hypertension, diabetes, or asthma, in the way that we look at that as a failure. Right. And so like a relapse is not necessarily a failure if you're hypertensive, right? Or if you have asthma or if you're type 2 diabetic. But in addiction, it's a failure. And it's because we don't look at it. We still use this archaic model of viewing addiction as it's either black or white, right? And we don't, or you're either better or you're not. And really, addiction, being a chronic illness means it requires chronic recovery, chronic maintenance, chronic changes. A relapse isn't necessarily a failure. It means that we need to adjust or change something. That's what we would do if we were working with a patient in any of those other medical diseases, right? We would see a relapse in symptoms, and we'd say, okay, we need to make adjustments to this plan to make sure that things are identified, that supports, resources are put in place, different interventions are put in place to support this individual. With substance use disorder and addiction, we don't typically do that. We see a relapse and we say, nope, didn't get it. You know what I mean? Let's start all over again. And it's that starting all over again, or that failure process that just cycles the psyche of a person who's struggling with substance use to like, well, I'm a failure. I've messed up again. I'm not going to get this. I don't want to get this. This is too hard. So I think language and the way that we approach working with a family with substance use disorder, an individual with substance use disorder, or in that system is extremely important, because without that, we're not addressing it from the disease that it actually is.
So, with that low self-esteem, how can that kind of play into one's thinking about their parenting and their capacity for parenting when it comes to they're really struggling with substance use disorder, and maybe they have a better understanding of all the things that you just said. Maybe their loved ones and family and friends and stuff like that. Maybe they do, maybe they don't, but it's affecting them personally on a personal level. So their self-esteem is already pretty low. How could that maybe also affect their belief in their parenting or their ability to parent?
Sure. So at its core, addiction, the emotion that drives addiction is shame, right? The feeling of not worthy, not enough. And it's different from guilt, right? We often think about guilt as like I did something wrong, where shame is I am wrong, right? The core characteristics of who I am, what makes me me, is wrong. And so when we look at people who are struggling with substance use, and then all of a sudden a family service organization gets involved and it's questioning their parenting, it just deepens that cut into shame, right? And now every decision they make regarding their parenting style, should I do this? Am I a fit parent? Is under the microscope of someone else. And, as a parent myself, and as someone who's conducted assessments for, child welfare agencies on fitness of parents, parenting's hard, right? No one's qualified.
Yeah.
It's one of the few jobs that you can get that no one's ever going to be qualified to do, right? There is no black or white, right or wrong decision for the most part. There's a lot of gray area in parenting. But when you add in the shame and guilt, primarily the shame that's involved with addiction and substance use, now all of a sudden you add in the magnifying glass of someone's going to be looking at your every parenting decision. It just deepens that shame, right? It deepens it. It makes it harder. So one of the things that we always work towards on the treatment side, and I think would be essential on the, the family services side, who's working with these families, is to try and level the playing field as much as we can, right? Anytime we're working with someone in treatment, we know that there's the power dynamic is hierarchical, right? It is differential. And so anything we can do to level the playing field, to make it, instead of us versus them, but make it, we're in this together, I think that's the same way that we have to approach it. I know that typically when I am working with families who are involved with family service systems, they're like, they're very secretive. They, oh, well, that's my, I don't really want to talk about that, or, and so they're very guarded towards the family service workers. And, rightfully so. Again, this is their parenting being put under a microscope. It's also, to them, it feels adversarial. So any way we can make it more collaborative, any way that we can approach this situation to be more connecting as opposed to disconnecting would really improve that.
Yeah, and I think there's a shift towards that, but maybe from your perspective, what else needs to happen from the perspective of the home visitor, the family services worker, or even just the system at large that needs to continue to change or evolve in their approach to working with individuals affected by substance use disorder and parents that are in recovery, to continue to kind of shift that mindset and, like you said, make it more collaborative as opposed to adversarial, because I think it's so naturally heavy on the adversarial side of things and heavy on the I'm under a microscope and there's a surveillance side of things. So even though I think there's some efforts to kind of shift that mindset, but what else needs to happen?
Well, I think taking a deeper dive into understanding how the substance use disorder works for that person. And I think that's one of the few questions that people ever get asked when they're struggling with addiction or substance use, is they're always, they know all the reasons why it's not working, right? Well, here's, all of a sudden my kids are being removed, or there's an investigation, or I'm under arrest, or this happened or that happened. And so they know all the things that aren't working. But understanding from the caseworker side, how was this working? Right? How are substances working for you in your life? Because nobody I've ever met who's been addicted went to their third grade guidance counselor meeting and said, like, I want to be addicted to drugs when I grow up. That's going to be my professional career, right? No one chooses that, right? Typically, substance use starts as a way, it's a solution before it's a problem. And so if we can understand the culture of how that was a solution, right? And so like I dive back into my social work days as a student, right? Like understanding, that term cultural competence, which is totally irrelevant. No one's competent in anyone else's culture. But I prefer the term cultural humility, right? Taking an approach of humility towards understanding, how is this working for you? How do substances work in your life? Whether it's to help numb the pain, help you deal with stress, what are the coping skills? themselves was this, are you dealing with a physical or chronic pain ailment that the substances are helping? Is it a social thing? Is it a potentially an ethnic or national cultural thing that, that supports or that separates you or that brings you together from members of your community? And so really helping to understand that, and then we can work to kind of reverse engineer how we can support that person to meet those needs that the substance was meeting without having to use the substance.
It's kind of very counterintuitive way of thinking about things, but because there is so much stigma and shame and guilt around that, right? And it's looked at as this negative thing, right? What would be sort of your advice to helping that frontline child welfare worker or anyone really to sort of rewire their brain? Like you mentioned, just a deeper understanding, right? But like, what needs to happen in the day-to-day practice and the sort of the reminders and that ongoing humility? What are the practical, like concrete things that somebody could hold on to maybe to remind themselves to say like, is it just the reminders of like, yes, I need to be more empathetic. I need to have more humility around this, or are there other sort of like practical concrete strategies that you would recommend?
Sure. So one of the mantras that I have in my head whenever I'm working with someone with substance use, particularly when there's family systems involved, is there's a quote by Marsha Linehan, who is the creator of DBT. And she said, the people that we're working with are doing the best that they can, and they can do better. Right. And so always understanding that the behavior that we're seeing from these people, no matter what it is, right, whether it's substance use, violent behavior, total emotional liability where they're up and down, all of those behaviors developed as a context for them to survive. There's a huge correlation and overlap between trauma, life traumas and substance use disorders. And that's not, anything earth shattering, but understanding that for the most part, most people are using as a way to cope with stuff that happened, right? Whether it was child abuse that they experienced or current things that are going on in their life, major events that have happened. And so helping to understand that, right? And understanding that the substance use wasn't intentionally there to create these problems, right? And the behaviors that are subsequent are a result. The substance use for most people isn't usually the problem. It's a subsequent set of behaviors and ways of obtaining substances and things like that that become problematic. It's not the substance itself. The substance typically is a symptom of the disease, the same way that elevated blood sugar is a symptom of diabetes, right? It's not, but there's more underlying that, you know what I mean? And it's the same thing with substance use. There's more underlying that. Like, it's like, why is a person choosing to do this? Pretty much everybody I've ever met, when they come to the point of understanding their substance use or when they're ready to confront their substance use, understands that it's a problem, but they also see it as the only solution that they have, or at least the primary solution that they have. And so it's kind of like that scene, and I'm dating myself here, right? But in Indiana Jones, when he has to move the orb and then replace it with the sandbag, you have to do it really quick before the big rock falls. Like, we're taking away this primary coping mechanism that people have to deal with their stress and all the stuff that they have. And we need to make sure that what we're putting on there is of equal support or equal value. Otherwise, we get run over by a big rock, I think, or something like that.
So is it as simple as that, really, of finding that replacing the negative behavior, with something positive is just, or whatever the symptom might be, right? Like I have loneliness, I have depression, I have anxiety, and I use these substances to self-medicate or cope. And thinking about it almost as what I'm kind of hearing you say maybe is thinking about that as not necessarily a bad thing, but like, so if you have this issue, you let's say loneliness, for example. Sure. And you use alcohol to be able to be more social. Yeah. Is it just then taking that issue of loneliness for that person and saying like, well, what could you do to replace the substance with increasing your social, and there's like social anxiety for people and stuff like that. But so is it as simple as that? We just need to like really help encourage the person to think about how they can replace what in their mind that is, if they think is working for them in terms of using that substance, with something that's positive.
So unfortunately, it's not that simple. And I figured you knew that, or like we were going there. But, I mentioned earlier that definition of addiction that the American Society of Addiction Medicine developed. In their second line, they identify addiction as a biological, psychological, social, and spiritual disease, right? So addiction affects a person biologically, the way that their brain and body interact, the way that they respond to certain substances, the way that they feel when they take substances, substances, things like tolerance and withdrawal, for example, the ability to take more or feeling sick when you don't have the substance. Then psychological, right? The way that we deal with stress, regulate mood, the way that we think, the way that we view the world around us. Social, right? It affects the way that we interact with people, the way that we don't interact with people. Towards end stage addiction makes every social decision you have. What events you're going to go to, which ones you're not going to go to, how you're going to perform at work, how you're not going to perform at work, are you going to stay at work? And then finally spiritual, and this one's tricky, right? Because typically when you hear the word spirituality, people get a little like,
Yeah.
And I want to quickly operationalize the term spirituality as, this is one that I remember reading in a social work textbook in grad school, and it was that spirituality is the general human experience of finding a sense of purpose, meaning, and value to one's life. You can organize that into an institutional practice and traditions and things like that and call it religion, but it's not religion, right? What we're talking about when we refer to spirituality is the general human experience that we all have of finding some sense of purpose, meaning, and value to our life. And so everyone has that. And so, for some people involved in the child welfare system, maybe family is that spiritual connection. Maybe having that connection is there. Maybe the social supports are affected because now I'm a parent and my friend group or the things that I used to do socially aren't really there for me anymore, right? And so how do I reinforce that? Or is there a balance between my previous social life and my spiritual life, right, which has now become my family? Is there more than just my family, right? Like, again, as a father, I think about like I have, 2 kids and a wife that I'm, committed to, and they're a huge part of my life. And I have an extended family that is a huge part of my life. But then there are other things that I find myself interested in, like helping others and working with others and growing, coaching sports and things like that. So like spirituality to me is more than just, it's a constant journey. It's a constant growth factor. Then, like I said, biologically, so many people struggle with illnesses, pain, just general physical things that substances kind of fill a void for. Are those things being overlooked? Early on, most people approach treatment because of some biological need, right? I'm sick, I'm in withdrawal, I was in a car accident, my doctor, I got lab work done and they said I need to stop drinking or I need to stop using, right? Biological needs push people. Very few and far between do we see people come in on the other end in the middle of an existential crisis saying, I feel like my life has no meaning or purpose anymore, right? But each one of those areas, right, when I talk about biologically, psychologically, socially, and spiritually, are equally as important. They're like legs on a stool, right? All 4 legs need to be supported. Also, 4 legs need to be reinforced. Otherwise the stool's a little bit wobbly and has a chance of falling over. And so in order to support that person, each one of those supports needs to be there. And I think for a social service worker, understanding that all 4 of those areas are equally as important, and how can we or how can they help foster that or provide resources and connect that in a way that supports them.
Right. You talked about family, and family could mean a lot of different things. There's extended family. There's, people that are not really blood related, but people consider them family anyway.
Sure.
When kinship caretakers become involved, I think it can become obviously a lot stickier, for lack of a better adjective, right? For that individual, they feel a responsibility to assist them and to the children, but then it's their own child who is the biological parent that's struggling with substance use disorder. What do you say to someone that's kind of a worker and or that kinship caregiver that's balancing that relationship and those dynamics around, like I mentioned, they're disappointed by the substance use, but they also have these other responsibilities, and the worker needs to try to engage them. And also, it's just a balancing act. So what would you what's your advice around engaging with the kinship caregiver when it comes to substance use?
Sure. So that's a really difficult question, because so many times, when these kinship caregivers are now taking on a parenting role that they weren't intending to take on, it's more work. And my answer for them is going to be that in top of the more work that you've just taken on, you've taken on even more work, because now you need to do work for yourself. I think it's vitally important that kinship caretakers or anyone who's struggling with a family member or loved one who's struggling with addiction gets their own help and support, whether that's through self-help groups, whether that's through individual therapy, whether that's through a peer support group or something like that, some type of support, because it's not water cooler conversation at work, right? No one's walking up to the water cooler at work at at break time and talking about how their daughter overdosed this weekend and they were supposed to see their grandchild, and now they're taking care of, like, it's not stuff that. And again, that shame that we talked about with addiction then drives it even further home with the family member, right? And so the family members, the kinship family members that are now in guardianship are struggling to not hate their own child or in some way, or their own family member, while they're watching another, that family member's behavior inadvertently affect the other, child that they're taking care of. And so, we have a saying in the world of recovery, like, hate the disease, not the person, right? Know that your loved one that's struggling with substance use is not doing and behaving the way that they're behaving in order to hurt someone, right? You can hate the disease and that it causes them to act in a certain way, but that's not them. The parents that I've seen that have, worked towards recovery are, even at their worst moments in active addiction, are incredible parents, right? They're so committed, and they can be so committed, and they love their family, even in the throes of active addiction. And I've seen it before. I've talked with people before who are in the throes of active addiction and said to them, like, you missed a visit this week. You were supposed to see your kids, or you didn't show up, and they're like, yeah, I did it intentionally because I don't want to hurt my kids even more by showing up in this condition, or, you know what I mean? And I think in my head, like, how difficult would that be to love someone and want to see them, but make the decision not to? Right. Because of how much more it would hurt them to see them, right? And so sometimes I've seen parents, take the selfish route and, like, I'm going to show up anyway, and they're impaired, and then it turns into an event. And so, for the kinship caregiver, understanding that in addition to, like, addiction, by the time it reaches that level where a person is, now involved with family service systems and they're needing help, that the disease is spread, right? The same way a cancer would. It metastasizes to everybody in the family. And so the kinship caregiver that's now providing, guardianship for the child needs to get their own help. Right. Needs to get their own help, because it's hard. There's no black and white, right? In terms of what is the right way to support this person, because the question is always, am I helping? Am I enabling? Right. And sometimes the same behavior, right? Like providing them with $40 cash so they can buy groceries may seem like it's enabling and may seem like it's helping. You don't really know, right? And so finding guidance and support is extremely helpful. But again, it puts on the challenge that, like, okay, I'm now taking on a role that's taking up a lot more time than I anticipated by taking on a child. And now you're asking me to do even more on top of that. But without it, I think it's even more devastating. It's more challenging for individuals. So
yeah, and I think also too for that kinship caregiver, I think it's only a natural human inclination or emotion to be like, if that, that biological parent relapsed or continues to struggle, there's disappointment. But you would not act the same way if you went into remission for cancer, right? No. People would feel a lot more sympathy and empathy for that Absolutely. Individual, but we still kind of feel like continue to struggle with dealing with the disappointment in the same way Sure. and the frustration in the same way. So.
Sure. And that's why I think, again, treatment is so important, right? Because when we talk about someone who's struggling with something like cancer, right? If you find out you have cancer, most people are willing to do whatever is required, right, in order to address the illness, right? And perhaps their illness, perhaps the cancer diagnosis has prevented them from getting up and making their kids lunch and getting them on the school bus. And so now it's affecting their parenting, it's affecting their life, and someone's going to come in and help and support them. And let's say the children go live with grandma and grandpa while this person is battling cancer and going through treatment, right? Like, we would look at that situation and say that that's a good decision, healthy decision made by both parties. Now, if that individual who has cancer decides they're not going to do any treatment, they're just going to sit at home and they're going to, I'm going to wait it out, or I'll go to chemo one day, but I'm not going to go every day. Or, like, they said radiation, but I don't really feel like doing that because I don't want my hair to fall out, right? Like, now all of a sudden you look at that person and be like, well, what are you doing, right? And, typically with cancer, we don't see that. If someone's dealing with a medical illness, they're willing to do what they need to do in order to address the disease to move back. With addiction, however, a lot of times when that placement changes, the individual's like, well, my life is a little bit more manageable, and now I can do these things. Or maybe, I don't really need treatment. What I really need to do is I got to get a job, and I think that people don't understand the severity that addiction causes in their life in terms of every system that becomes affected. And so, for the kinship caregiver, we have to look at what is the individual doing to move towards the direction of recovery, right? If all they're doing is saying, I'm just not going to use, right? And, I'm just going to pick myself up by my bootstraps and go back to work and I'll be ready in a couple of weeks. That's not enough. I mean, it hasn't been enough in most cases in my experience. I just haven't seen that work. And so when that time happens when placement changes, in my opinion, that's the time when the individual who's dealing with a substance use disorder needs to take all of the help that they can get and get all of the treatment that they can get to support themselves. And again, like I mentioned, addiction is a long-term chronic illness. It requires a long-term course of treatment. It's not 2 or 3 weeks. I see it all the time where people show up. I had it happen yesterday. Someone showed up at our agency and they're like, yeah, this is just for 2 weeks, right? And it's like, what I mean? It's almost like dropping your car off at the garage and being like, yeah, can you just change some plugs and wires, top off the fluids, I'll be good to go in a couple of weeks. And I'm like, it doesn't work like that. Like you've done 40 years worth of damage in your life. It's not going to be undone in 2 weeks, right? It's going to be a lot longer. And so, helping both sides, both the individual with the identified substance use disorder and the family, understand that the process is going to take some time. And it's typically not linear, right? It's not always in a straight progress upwards, right? There's bumps in the road. Typically, the progression will tend to increase and go in the right direction. But there could be slips and bumps on the road. And I'm not even just talking about substance use. I'm talking about the emotional reactions, the coordination of life and figuring out how to live on life's terms again. I think that becomes really difficult for people. And I think for family members, I know I've seen the experience multiple times where, the individual's working on themselves in treatment and now they're going to connect with, their family members, their loved ones who have been supporting them. And they're like, now they're being mean to me. And I'm like, well, they're not being mean to you. They're just now able to confront you on some of the things that they haven't been able to, have some closure on or have some discussions with you on before. Perhaps because you were too fragile and they were scared that having that discussion with you before was going to lead to a total meltdown. And so like the difficult conversations that you're having, these emotional conversations that you're having with the people around you, one, need to be had, because if they're not had, resentments just sit around and things just never get resolved. But two, they're being had because that's a sign that you're growing and they're ready to talk to you about these things. And so I think there's so many factors at play that support that, but understanding that it's not all puppies and rainbows once a person moves towards recovery. There's going to be a lot of ups and downs. Yep.
You mentioned the example of that motivation when it comes to getting cancer treatment, maybe being an impact, but how much more of an impact does intrinsic motivation play in someone's recovery, and how can that family service worker, frontline worker help that individual tap into some of their, in a non-clinical way, like tap into some intrinsic motivation?
Sure. So I always ask people, like, I'll take like the third grade approach to it. Like, just ask why, right? Like, well, why are you doing this? Well, I want to get my kids back. Why? You know what I mean? And like most people never ask that second one, like, why do you want to get your kids back there? The kids are tough. They're a pain. They're a lot of work. You got to wake up every morning. You can't call out sick. Like, why do you want that job? Right. And like help them understand what is that motivation. Because typically when people come into treatment, whether they're involved with family services agencies or not, there's some type of external motivation that's pushing them there. Whether it's a family member or the courts, lab work was high or positive, right? There's something outside of them that's pushing them. And sometimes there's a spark or a little sliver of internal motivation, right? And so our job on the treatment side is to, really try and encourage and build that internal motivation, because whatever that external motivation is eventually going to go away, or eventually you're going to desensitize to it, right? And so, thinking about long-term treatment and long-term success rates for, child welfare is like, how can the worker help to guide that internal motivation? A lot of times it's like, yeah, I want to get my kids back. For what? Like, what do you want? Why do you want to have them back? And help them explore, like, what do you want to do with your family? Like, what kind of parent do you see yourself being? Like, how can we get to that, right? How can you become that person? And I've also, and I think we talked about this, prior to going on air, I've also met with people who've, when asked that existential question, like, why do you want to have your kids back? Be like, I never thought about that, but maybe I don't want to be a parent. And I think it's a really difficult conversation to have, but it's an honest conversation, right? There are some people that have children that don't want to be parents. And those are really hard words for them to say. And I think if we can create a space for people to have that conversation or question, do I really want to be a parent? Do I want to be a parent now, right? Or do I want to be, do I want to support my child with my family, but maybe not be the primary caregiver. I think there's, you talked about family in different ways, and, the family tree doesn't look like the traditional 1950s family tree. Are there ways that we can help build that support system so that the individual can really look at what are the options for me in terms of being a parent, right? And how am I motivated enough? And eventually, like I said, that motivation's got to turn internal, right? It has to be for me, right? A lot of times, like I said, someone involved in family service systems, why are you here? Well, I want to get my kids back. Okay, that's great. Why? Help understand that. But ultimately, do you want to do this for you? Because if you don't want to do it for you, right? Let's say you get your kids back and, things go well. Now they're in school. All right. Yeah, exactly. Like, you have to have something while they're gone for 6-7 hours a day to continue to support that recovery. Because the minute that external pressure is off, it has to become internal. So, like, what can you do? One of my friends used to always say, we have to help people find a life that's worth living in recovery. Otherwise, it's not going to be worth keeping.
Right. Yeah.
And so building that life, what does that look like for them? Really helping explore their dreams and their goals, and seeing how recovery is going to fit into that versus how typically their substance use is not going to support that.
Right. It seems like such obvious questions too, right? Mm-hmm. But it's like, the phrase, it goes without saying, because sometimes you have to say those things, because if you don't ask why do you want your kids back, they might say, well, because they're, my kids and I love them. Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Like, tell me more. Like, what does it mean to you? I think, like, I like that, the layer, peeling back the layers of the onion to kind of dig a little bit deeper, because it seems like almost maybe even a silly question to ask. Mm-hmm. Like, yeah, of course I want my kids back. What are you talking about? Sort of, you might get that response right at first, but it's sort of asking continually, like, why? And I like to be able to kind of dig down to the core of the purpose and what is it really.
And most people don't explore that.
Reason behind it. Yeah.
Yeah. Most people don't explore that, and just, why would you want your kids back? What do you want to do with them? Like, all right, so you have your kids and everything's going good. What does that look like? We call that in therapy the miracle question, right? Like, you wake up tomorrow and everything's great in your life. What does your day look like? Mm-hmm. Right. And, like, helping them understand, and that helps them visualize what their life would be like, what the, you know what I mean? And helping them guide that, because, again, what it looks like, the first couple of months in involvement may be substantially different, 6 months, 9 months, 10 months, a year into their involvement and their recovery. And it may be different in 5 years, right? And so really helping them understand that, like, let's look at what you want to do, or how you want to do it, or what you're expecting your life to be like. And let's watch that evolve and grow and develop and foster that, so it becomes something that you want, right? Like, I'm not, when I, as a person in personal recovery, when I first got into recovery, I wanted what I wanted, right? But I wasn't sure what that was, you know what I mean? And what I wanted when I got sober in 2009 is substantially different from what I want in my life today. And that's okay. You know what I mean? It's okay that it's different, but it had to be what I wanted. If I got sober because of what my parents wanted, or what my friends wanted, or what my, high school soccer coach wanted, it would have been a totally different meaning.
I think even some of those reasons, I would imagine too, could disguise themselves as, this is what you could almost convince yourself that that's what you think, but it's really like you said, the extrinsic factors, the family, societal expectations, even things like that. And then, like you said, it's really difficult to then maybe admit that this isn't for me, maybe, or that maybe this is what I really want, like, because that's what I want. And I've really been able to differentiate and discern that this is really what I want, and not what society expects of me, or what my parents expect of me, or what, this is what I'm supposed to do. Like, and that I think there's value in some of that, but I think, like you said, really have to get to the core of it. So, and you mentioned, just as to kind of wrap things up, again, like, that intrinsic motivation is so key, right? Because some of that external motivation and pressure and some of the support and resources that individuals will get will stop. So they're going to have some sort of internal motivation at some point. But what other resources are out there for individuals with substance use disorder when support from formalized child welfare or, services, family services systems stop?
Sure. So there's, one of the good things about addiction, if there's a good thing about addiction, is the community and the recovery community has a various number of support system resources out there, from 12-step self-help support groups to other self-help support groups that are not as spiritually oriented. There are fitness organizations. There's an organization called Move to Heal that is very involved with helping individuals recover from mental health and substance use disorders, but from a physical fitness perspective. There are communities of faith. There are even just fitness gyms in general, you know what I mean? Like finding different things to get involved in. There are recovery coach support systems that are extremely valuable. A lot of treatment facilities or treatment programs now offer alumni programs that continue to support people after their graduation. So, for example, at Ocean State Recovery Center, we have an alumni program that if a person graduates the program, that they're eligible to go to in infinitum for the rest of their life for free, right? And so they can come to this meeting, and it's in a comfortable environment, and it's a safe environment, and it's a group of individuals that they've gotten to know, and they've gotten to see people that have gone through similar experiences. We have events, where we do a cookout every summer. We do alumni events, like we've done a kickball game and an indoor soccer game and things like that.
I would imagine that peer support really helps give that purpose too.
Exactly, yeah, because they get to see each other, and they also, interestingly enough, they get to bring their families, right? And so we've seen moms and dads come in, and they're broken and battered, and they're not allowed to see their kids, and maybe there's a no contact order, or maybe DCYF is involved, and a year or two later, they're bringing their kids to the event, and they're eating pizza with us, and they're playing kickball, and they're playing wiffle ball in the park, and it's like, and they're looking forward to, all right, in 3 months we're going to have another event. And so for them, in their mind, it's like, all right, I need to keep things together, because in 3 months we're going to do this, and I'm going to get to see all my friends again, and it's just a really cool event. And so the resources are out there for individuals. Traditionally, it was always there's self-help, there's AA, and there's NA, and that's pretty much it. And there are so many other organizations now. And that's not to belittle the benefits that 12-step self-help organizations really have, and can be extremely invaluable to individuals in terms of supporting that ongoing recovery and supporting that, and that sense of connection and community. But they no longer hold the monopoly on that in the recovery world. There are other organizations, but there's so many opportunities.
All right. And I think most of what you just mentioned is not really formal treatment,
no, it's
psychotherapy treatment, and it's less formal things, and not to minimize those supports to kind of help continue the person and guide them in their recovery. But there's so many other things that can help as well. So.
Yeah, and most importantly, they're free. Almost everything I've just mentioned is free, which is that's the right cost for most people.
Yeah. Chris, thank you so much. Any final words of advice for some of our, some child welfare individuals, public, private, working with? There's so many different, roles that child welfare staff have to play, and the intersection between, working with parents and recovery, and just working with families that are, affected by recovery and substance use. Any final words of advice?
One of the things that, it just comes to mind for me, because I know that some of these situations, or most of these situations, all of these situations can be so difficult, and everybody who's involved in it feels like they're going through hell. And there's a Winston Churchill quote that sticks in my mind, and it's, if you're going through hell, keep going. Right? I see so many people give up, because they're in the worst parts of their life. They're struggling, and like, oh my God, I've got this going on, I've got that going on, and they just throw their hands up, and they're like, oh, this is like hell, and I give up. It's like, that's not what you want to stop. Like, if you're going through hell, keep going, get yourself out, right? Like, keep working. It will get better, right? Recovery is absolutely possible. Sustainable recovery is absolutely possible. I see experiences of it every day. I live the experience of it every single day, but it requires work. And so if you're going through hell, if you feel like everything's against you, keep going. It will get better. And so that'll be it.
Yeah. Is he the one that also said it's always darkest before the dawn?
Yeah, I believe so.
I think so.
There's a lot of quotes that have been attributed to him.
Churchill, he's got quite a few. Yeah.
If you're not sure who said it, you can usually attribute it to him.
Unknown or Churchill. Yeah. No. Chris, thank you.